Welcome, everyone. Just want to take a minute to introduce everyone here, just in case anyone isn't familiar. So, with me tonight is Andy Mercer, who composed the music you just heard. So, Andy, instead of exorcising demons, uses demons to exorcise his neighbors.
Absolutely.
And also with me is Steve Ward, who has replaced Mothman as Point Pleasant's weirdest resident.
And happy to do so.
And joining us now, hi, Bill.
Good evening. Hi, Susie. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too.
I think I know these other two guys I can see.
I think you've heard me before, but I usually hide don't have a camera on, but I managed to find one this time for a change.
Hi, Andy. How are you?
I'm pretty good, Bill. How are you doing?
I've got no legitimate complaints. Hello, Steve.
Hey, how's it going, Bill? I'm looking for your introduction here. There we go.
Oh, boy.
Just by the way, will Jackie be able to stay with us tonight?
You know what? I just got off the phone with her, and she's on the way home. She won't be here for an hour or so.
Okay. Susie, shall I go ahead and introduce Bill?
Absolutely.
And I'm going to introduce Jackie as well in case she can join us later. Jackie and Bill Kuselis, PhD, are authors of Bridging the Tragedy, a book based upon the 1967 Silver Bridge disaster in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, Mothman, and post-traumatic growth, a phenomenon that often occurs after tragedy. Bill's interest in the paranormal began in the late 70s with the original Project UFO television series. In 2003, he was introduced to the Mothman Prophecies movie, and it changed his life. Jackie is a retired USPS postmaster and a current business owner-operator. She specializes in research, data analysis, and connecting the dots between intuition, perception, and reality. Since 2016, Bill and Jackie have visited Point Pleasant regularly, where they have become friends with several area residents, including Mothman Museum owner Jeff Wamsley and the late Carolyn Harris, co-founders of the Mothman Festival. Bill holds a doctorate in psychology with a focus on post-traumatic growth, the good things that can come from bad experiences. They reside in Sycamore, Illinois, and it's great to see Bill again.
Good to see you, Steve.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us, Bill. And it's funny because one of the points that kind of hit me the most when I read the Mothman Prophecies the first time was, Mothman's kind of the least interesting part of the whole story, right? And the way Keel described the bridge collapse itself, everyone kind of glosses over that. But I'm from a small town about the same size as Point Pleasant. And I just, if that number of people had died in my hometown, I think about that would have been the end of the world for us, at the time. That's such a huge event that everyone kind of glosses over when they talk about this. So your insight, I think, is perfect for this.
Well, thank you. You're right. I think you're the first person besides me that I've ever heard say that the Mothman was really not the most interesting or central part of the whole tale. I mean, the Mothman Prophecies is named the Mothman Prophecies, but I think that a lot of the times people forget what the prophecies really were. We hear about the black wings. We hear about people being scared, their red eyes, chasing cars, all this kind of stuff. And that's fascinating and it's horrifying. But the prophecies and the Silver Bridge disaster are equally powerful, if not more so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, I'd like to say that, I was a follower of John Keel back in the early days, which everybody that has heard Andy and my show knows that. But I got the Mothman Prophecies book as soon as it was available. And I visited Point Pleasant a couple of years later to kind of see the area. But it wasn't until 2006, I went to my first Mothman Festival, met some of the people there. And then the next time I read the Mothman Prophecies and read that chapter on the bridge collapse, it really hit home. It wasn't just a story. People that I met people that survived the disaster. I met people that were in town at the time and saw the collapse or heard it, and it just made a whole difference in the story. To actually have been there and met the people in Point Pleasant.
And now you live there.
And now I live there. Yes, on the
Yeah.
very road that the Scarberries and Mallets were chased by the winged Garuda. I mean, who would have thought? That a kid in junior high who read that first major report that hit the wire services all over the world about the two couples chased the TNT area into Point Pleasant, and now here I am.
And what you said, Steve, really resonates with me because after we've been traveling to Point Pleasant, we've probably been there 10 times since 2016, at least once a year, if not twice. And we've gotten to be friendly with so many people there. It really is just a wonderful, wonderful small town. And having interviewed people that we did for our book and gotten to know them, really at an intimate level. Jimmy Wedge lost both his mom and dad in the bridge disaster. Susan Sayer talked about how things were in her 5th grade classroom when Kathy Bias's chair was pulled out because they never could find her body in the river. I mean, all these different things. We watched the Mothman Prophecies movie, and I'm a junkie. I mean, I've probably watched it hundreds of times. But when we watched it for the first time, front to end, after we did the interviews and got to know the people that we did, I mean, I had tears come to my eyes when that bridge went down because I know now what it felt like for those people who lost their parents, their children, their friends. You feel it. I mean, it's just such a powerful story.
It's interesting that you were introduced to all this from the film. And as someone who works occasionally at the Mothman Museum and greets people and answers their questions, so many people, very few people have read the book. Few people have read anything by John Keel, but so many have been introduced by that film, which now is about 20 years old. So that's really amazing that film had such an impact on you when you saw it.
It pulled me in, but when I picked up the book, started reading that, and then of course downloaded the audio version and have read and listened to that thing countless times. At that point, it became part of who I am. I mean, fundamentally. And Susie, like you said, for me, we live in Sycamore, Illinois, which is a little bigger than Point Pleasant. It's closer to 19,000 people, but 5 miles to the north of us is a small town called Genoa. It's almost exactly the same size as Point Pleasant. So whenever I talk about the bridge disaster and about Point Pleasant with people who live in our area, I always say that picture a town of Genoa losing 46 people in a bridge disaster. If you didn't know somebody in the bridge disaster, you knew somebody who was in the bridge disaster.
Yeah. When I was in high school, we had 2 kids that got killed in a crash. And I remember how the town shut down practically. And that was 2 people. So it's kind of even hard to fathom 46 at a time.
What we heard from the people that we interviewed was disbelief. When they heard the Silver Bridge collapsed, or even people who knew because they saw or came upon it shortly after it went down, when they told family members, the family members didn't believe them. They said, you must mean a smaller bridge, or you must mean part of the Silver Bridge. The Silver Bridge didn't just fall into the water. That didn't happen, but absolutely it did. So yeah, super powerful and just life altering for that whole region, really.
And do either of you know, did people in town immediately connect the bridge collapse with Mothman, or was that afterwards that came to be?
You're asking me?
Either of you, if either of you have an opinion.
I'm just listening for Steve because I've been rambling for a while.
Well, I think that when, there still may have been sightings of this creature or apparition or whatever it was. There still may have been UFO reports. I think that horrible disaster took everybody's mind off that. It was when there's a part in the book by John Keel where these strangers, these call them men in black if you want, or just these creepy dudes that came in to talk to Mary Heyer, the reporter, friend and colleague of John Keel, that wrote the column Where the Waters Mingle. Here she is dealing with the bridge disaster and people's deaths and keeping up with the news, and some creepy dude asks her about UFO reports in the area. If it was still going on, nobody gave a damn about it anymore. Now, I tend to think there are a lot of people think Mothman was a harbinger. Some think that it created the disaster somehow. I tend to think that all this, and there's so, and Susie, you're right, because Mothman isn't the only strange thing that happened during that time period. UFOs, strangers they called men in black, animal mutilations, a psychic phenomena. I tend to think that it all just happened at the same time that the bridge collapsed. I don't think there was a direct connection, but in people's hearts and minds, there is a connection because it happened within that same about 13 months. And so that's why it's so amazing that, it mentioned Carolyn Harris, that's great lady that Bill and Jackie met when they came down to Point Pleasant. I met her when I came down to Point Pleasant, co-founder of the Mothman Festival, a superb lady. She lost her young son. Her son was crossing the bridge with her ex-husband at that time. But nevertheless, even though, again, this tragedy is connected with the weird stuff that happened that year, she was all about doing whatever she could to bring the town back. She must have had great foresight. I mean, who would have thought that this little festival would erupt into thousands of people, bringing millions of dollars into the town? But it was due to people like Carolyn that just forged ahead and did not let that tragedy, like this is that kind of stuff that Bill writes about, did not let that horrible tragedy win and just bog everything down. So I don't think Mothman had a direct connection with this bridge collapse.
And I agree. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Susie.
So I was going to say, in the beginning of the book, Keel tells this story. I think it was a home in New York that was haunted by a man wearing a cape and a slouch hat, but there was never anyone that lived there that fit that description, except for there was a writer who wrote a book with a character with that description, kind of implying it's like a tulpa type thing. And when the bridge collapsed and it took everyone's minds to the bridge and everything going on there and away from all the strange activity, the activity slowed down, at least, if not stopped for a while. So them not focusing on it anymore and focusing on something else may have been what stopped it from happening.
And that's what Jeff Wamsley says too. He said that although there still were sightings, people didn't want to talk about Mothman because we're burying loved ones now. We've had this horrible tragedy happen. This is real. We can quantify this. It's right in front of us. It's a horrible disaster. We don't want to hear about any quote unquote nonsense. Now, that stuff was still happening. I don't think that it stopped, although it had slowed down a little bit towards the tail end of 67 as it was anyhow. But yeah, absolutely. To answer your original question, I think it's more of a contemporaneous type thing, two different things happening at the same time. And my thought would be that if Mothman had anything to do whatsoever with the bridge disaster, it was more as a harbinger or as a warning. I don't think that it caused that disaster to happen.
Yeah, we like to blame things we don't understand and vilify and demonize entities. I'm not going to talk about puckwudgies, Steve. I see you making the face.
Well, I will say this. Susie and I have discussed the way that so many people blame Native American curses for so many things. I mean, can't we just cut the Native Americans some slack and, look elsewhere for curses, for crying out loud?
We did enough. Like, leave them alone.
I'd say from a UK perspective, if you like, I've come to this the other way around. I first saw the movie, then read the book afterwards. I remember watching the movie thinking, this is amazing, I must learn more about this. For me, as an observer, it gave the impression that there was a correlation between the collapse, but more, as you guys have said, more of a sense of a warning of something that's going to happen. But one of the theories I kind of find interesting is the very fact that that dramatic event occurred caused ripples almost through time, if you like, going backwards, so that these strange anomalous occurrences were caused by the collapse, by sending sort of strange impressions backwards through time, if you like, and causing anomalies to start to occur in a build-up towards a rather dramatic event. And that kind of relationship I found really quite fascinating. The possibility there's some kind of connection in that sense, that it almost like a backwards compatibility effect of the strange sightings were caused by an event that yet to occur. I don't think it kind of makes any sense. But that's one of the ways I've sort of looked at the idea. But for me, certainly reading the book after having seen the movie, I was like, bloody hell, this is even more strange and bizarre than the movie is. It was quite taken by that fact. And as you guys already saying, John Keel talked a lot of stuff in the book that relates to the more general sense of weirdness that I found absolutely fascinating. It's really got me into this sort of area more than the more conventional ghost stuff, which is my background has been ghost investigations for many, many years, to moving into the more the stranger stuff, shall we say. And that for me was a real eye-opener, reading the book, having seen the movie.
And think about how the editors, I love the way Keel would talk about the faceless editors, cut out half his manuscript, for crying out loud, which fortunately some of it was salvaged in The Eighth Tower, which is kind of a follow-up.
Yes, but, I must read that, actually. I've not read that one yet. I must get hold of that and read that.
Yeah, good stuff. And the one that I've talked about before, Operation Trojan Horse, is one of the books that did a major change around for me. Susie, I noticed that Horace Smith has asked about the relationship between Keel and Gray Barker. Is it okay if I expound on that a little bit?
That was on my list of things to ask you. So thank you, Horace, for reminding me.
Gray Barker, I actually met Gray Barker at the 1976 MUFON Symposium. I won't go into that story, but I got to talk to him and ask him a bunch of questions. It was very cool. Never got to meet John Keel. John Keel, now Gray Barker was kind of a trickster. He would, some of the stuff he wrote was legitimate, but he wasn't above embellishing. And for example, his first book, famous book, was called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, which was all about the Men in Black, right? I think the first book written about the Men in Black. And these, of course, are the alleged UFO silencers that come and visit people that have seen UFOs or taken photographs and want to confiscate them. He said, Gray started, in an interview he gave, he said Gray started writing this book and he was serious about it, and then he kind of threw up his hands and started making it up. He said you have to be very careful with Gray Barker. In fact, there was a guy that in the town that I lived in 2 years ago before I moved down to Point Pleasant. I won't give his name, but he wrote a book published by Gray Barker. And Gray said, hey, if you pretend to be this particular person that was silenced by the Men in Black, I'll publish your book. So he was like, it's 17 or 18. So he said, okay, sounds good. And then years later, I think it was in the 90s, he came forward and said, I was just a young kid and it was just all made up. I forget the name of the character in the book. But Barker was, if you ever get a chance to visit the Gray Barker archives, they're in the Clarksburg Library. There's a separate building there, and there's a room devoted to this awesome library of Gray Barkers, including 6 issues of the UFO Phenomenon, which was the publication that our high school UFO club published. If you open up a certain file, there they are. But yeah, so and one last thing, there's Gray Barker wrote his own book about before Keel did, about Point Pleasant and the Mothman, called The Silver Bridge. And I even asked Barker about that, because a lot of people said that Keel just ripped off Gray Barker, and of course he didn't. And it was funny because Gray Barker says, "Oh, I'm sure John." No, he said, "None of us like to get our literary toes stepped on, but I'm sure John wrote his own book." He was such a character. But there's a chapter in there about Gray Barker and John Keel when they went to Point Pleasant. And John Keel said he got everything wrong. So he had to rewrite the chapter. So that chapter in The Silver Bridge was written by John Keel.
I think Keel
Wasn't there
liked.
a point where one of the Men in Black characters said he was a friend of Gray Barker too?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, didn't
In the
remember.
Mothman Prophecies. And I'm trying to think. I was just listening to the audio version of it over the course of the last week just to kind of refresh my memory a little bit. But there is a guy who I think, and Steve, help me out here a little bit. It was the part in the book where I think it's on Long Island where there was a family that had witnessed a UFO and a number of people were coming to the house and checking things out. I may be getting stuff convoluted, but I remember that there was a guy who showed up at this house and he was asking questions about Keel, but they had a baby and he wasn't even acknowledging the fact that the baby was there.
Okay, that was
around for like 5 hours. Am I convoluting?
that was actually in or around Point Pleasant. It was the Scarberries. It was little
Okay.
Scarberries baby. And this guy it said he was Jack Brown. He was this little short, creepy guy, in quotes, a Men in Black type. Now, it could be that, some of these people we associate with the dreaded Men in Black might just be a little strange. I mean, we've all been in this realm for a while, and we all know people that are a little strange, right? Okay. No names are going to be mentioned here. But he showed up and he had a tape recorder that he didn't seem to know how to operate. He said he was from Cambridge, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And when he met somebody else from that area, he didn't seem to know anything about Cambridge. So it was just totally bizarre. He that was the infamous Jack Brown. And always wanted to meet that guy.
I wanted to make a comment about the last question that the gentleman kind of kicked out to us here about Keel and Barker. There's one place in one of the Keel compilation books, one of the articles that Keel wrote, and he was talking about Barker, and he used the term faction because Gray Barker would blur fact and fiction into what he called faction. And I like what Steve was saying also. I remember, specifically when he was talking about doing this writing and how he was really immersed in what was like a report. He was like making a report, and then he just says, the hell with it, and just started making up all kinds of stuff after that. So I think that Keel thought you needed to be wary of Barker because of his research methods, and he just made things up, but he liked him too.
Oh,
he
sure.
genuinely liked him. They were friends.
Yeah, definitely.
It seems a real problem, though, to have somebody who was not presenting the full truth and was inventing part of it or rewriting part of it, because of course then people will detractors will say, oh, that throws it all into out of Keel, really. There you go, out of Keel. But it really does affect the whole area of research. And if one person is proven to be even faking things or something, making them or inventing or editing anyway, it really, I think, gives a problem to the whole picture. And we know there are people out there who completely debunk the entire thing, and it gives them fuel, unfortunately.
Well, and that's the problem too. I think when legitimate researchers decide to get involved with creative writing, it can taint their entire legacy, which is unfortunate because I think Gray did a lot of good work, and I think he was a very good writer. I mean, the whole Silver Bridge book that he wrote, I don't take it literally. I think it's meant to be more of an allegory, but it's really very well done, very creative.
And it's part of the whole picture. I mean, you have to be careful about reading everything. I mean, even John Keel got skunked once in a while. He accepted things that weren't true and made mistakes. So, and people that criticize Keel or anybody will focus on something they see as a mistake or whatever and amplify that, and then block out the whole important and we've all been through that.
Becomes a common problem. I mean, one of the things I researched a lot, and I actually did a show last week on a different network entirely about the Enfield poltergeist. That one is, again, it's a good example of the similar kind of thing where you've got the two teenage girls involved in the case. Now, can you expect two teenage girls to behave properly the whole time, not make things up, not fabricate stuff? Of course you can't. They're kids, but because they probably did some of the stuff wasn't real that they actually did to themselves. They didn't say the entire thing wasn't real because there were so many witnesses who were seeing strange poltergeist activity in the house. You had police officers, you had other adults in the building, you had researchers all seeing strange things occurring. But because the kids kind of admitted they made some of the stuff up themselves, people will dismiss the entire case as being all fabricated. So it is that problem when you have stuff that's been either deliberately faked or misconstrued almost deliberately to try and build the story, even though they think, well, maybe there's a different explanation for these events, but we'll go with the one that fits the narrative we're working on, which can often happen even to the best researchers.
Even in the Mothman Prophecies, there is an episode that was later unraveled as being a hoax. There's a guy by the name of Tom who is about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way into the Mothman Prophecies book. And he talks about having, he's waiting tables, and this guy comes in to one of the spots where he's waiting on tables, and he orders food, and he says that his name is Vadig. And his story was almost identical to what Woodrow Derenberger talked about with Indrid Cold, and even down to the point where he came for Tom and then took him on a rickety type of a spaceship to Lanulos, which is the same place that Cold said that he was from, to Derenberger. But then later on, it turned out to be an entire hoax. But Keel took it as gospel, and it's in the Mothman Prophecies. So was he perfect? Absolutely not. Did he make mistakes? I think we all do. But I don't think he deliberately set out to do that. I think this is somebody who duped him, and he thought it was legitimate.
And the reason he thought it was legitimate, this is Tom Montalone. Actually, Tom Montalone wrote the introduction to a book called The Mothman Files. And in there, he tells what happened. He said this was a college prank. He was telling John Keel all this nonsense, and he said he could see Keel was zoning out and he wasn't buying it. So he thought, I'm just going to pull stuff out of my, and he did. He came up with like black cars and men in black. He hit about 3 things that Keel had been investigating, but had kept close to his vest. He did not publish everything at the time, but to actually prevent hoaxes. So Keel at that moment thought, holy cow, this guy has had a real experience. So I don't know what it was, a bizarre coincidence or some kind of paranormal skullduggery. I don't know, but I can understand why he bought it at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, you could also talk about the whole Indrid Cold business itself, because Derenberger doesn't seem particularly credible, but yet he seems to feature quite prominently in the book. I always found that was quite interesting.
Well, Go ahead, Bill.
Well, I was going to say, and Andy, to your point, Keel, when he was interviewed later on, like years after the Mothman Prophecies came out, he was asked about Woodrow Derenberger and if he thought he was legitimate. And he said, I think that initially the first story was legitimate. But then after that, it seemed like he kind of lost it and went off the deep end and made up more and more encounters, and things got stranger and stranger and stranger after that. So I think he did buy it at first. He did believe him, but then he lost his credibility as time went on as far as Keel was concerned.
Well, as you recall, there were a couple other incidents that were very Indrid Cold-like, including one that happened before Derenberger came forward, almost identical. And it was in the same kind of a contact along Route 77, the elongated craft, the landing, a pointless conversation with an individual that looked suspiciously like Indrid Cold. And then the guy decided he wasn't going to go through with the story. And because he had told John Keel and Mary Heyer, and he said, that scientist fella said we should just forget all about it. And Keel said, what scientist fella? And he said, well, I don't know, but he seemed to know what he was talking about. And he said, well, how did he find out about your story? You didn't tell anybody except Mary Heyer and I. And he said, damned if I know. And then there was the woman in Gallipolis that had a very sort of an Indrid Cold-like experience with the craft and individuals. Another bizarre point, if these guys are from other planets, can't they have a more a deeper conversation than just some mundane babble back and forth, something we can quote in a book or something? But so it's the Indrid Cold thing is a complete paradox where some of it seems to be substantive, and I don't know whether it was black ops or paranormal, but some of it was just nonsense. So I don't know where to go with it.
There was a particular scene in the movie that I was wondering, I can't remember because I've not had a chance to fully read the books. I've been so busy with other things. But the scene in the movie where you have the voice on the phone talking to John Keel, and you have the analysis later on and saying this is just mechanical sounds. It's not a person's voice. They can hear someone speaking, but it's produced by a machine. Was that from the actual story or just made up for the movie? I can't really remember.
Well, it was there was a so-called Mr. Apple, APOL, that was in contact with a woman named Jay Perro. It was, the implication is that some of these contacts were actually more like channeling or whatever. And Keel said when he was actually talking to some of the contactees on the phone, they would say, well, so-and-so is here. And supposedly they'd be handing the phone to the entity, but he believed that they were actually, that the voice was actually coming through the contactee and talking to him on the phone.
Right.
So there were conversations like that with Mr. Apple, who probably didn't really exist. It was there's a couple of books, the Big Breakthrough and the Big Blackout, which are documents that Keel never published, that you can get from johnkeel.com by Doug Skinner. And this is a whole area where Keel seemed to be really buying into. I know Bill knows these books, where he was buying into these messages, but he wasn't talking to any of the people himself. These were all coming through all these different contactees, and there seemed a point where he was really freaking out. But if you read the Eighth Tower, there's a point in there where he writes that how he was embarrassed and how he was believing these messages. He'd be talking to a contactee out in the middle of the woods, channeling whatever, Ashtar from the great beyond, and it was all deception. It was all nonsense, the trickster, if you will. So there was they did take elements. In fact, with the film, if you get the DVD and you look at some of the extras, you see where they tried to get more of the book into the movie, but certain scenes were just deleted. So I got a chance to talk to the screenwriter, Richard Hammond, and I can talk about that a little bit later if you want to.
Yeah, so I think, Steve, this is a good question for you. Were Keel's thoughts about ultra-terrestrials well developed before his Mothman investigations, or were they a consequence of them?
I don't remember them being part of the Operation Trojan Horse book. Were they, Steve?
Well, I think he talked about, I don't remember if he used the term ultra-terrestrial, but he did talk about transmogrifications, one of my favorite words of all time.
I love that.
Transmogrifications of energy. You know, the only other place I've ever seen that is in Calvin and Hobbes comic strips, but that's an aside. But he, I think the idea of it was developed before the Mothman Prophecies, although I'm not sure what terms he used then.
Well, and interestingly enough, I think that he coined that. He didn't coin that phrase.
No.
He popularized it, but I think he really got it. Wasn't it from Ivan Sanderson?
He said Ivan Sanderson, and he also said he used it as kind of a literary device because he wanted to get people away from the notion that these things all had to be extraterrestrial. You know, he really thought these were something to do with a natural condition of the planet.
Something that Andy said a few minutes ago really dovetails nicely with this question about ultra-terrestrials, because I mean, half of the Mothman Prophecies book was edited out and then was republished as The Eighth Tower. So really those two books are supposed to be the same, but the editors, the faceless editors, took out, you know, a good chunk of that, where he really goes into the extraterrestrial or the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, and he talks about transmogrifications of energy. And I think one of the analogies I really like for, you know, what happened in Point Pleasant as well as other window type areas is that it's almost like a radio frequency. You know, if you're on, these things are able to slip through the cracks when the radio dial is set to a particular frequency, and then they can manifest, but otherwise they really can't. And he really goes into that in depth in The Eighth Tower. So I know we're supposed to be talking about the Mothman Prophecies. That should have been in the Mothman Prophecies. It just was edited out.
Yeah, definitely bring it up then, because it should be one book together for certain. I must read that even more so of what you're saying there, because that's, again, as I say, that's the ultra-terrestrial idea, is something that I kind of hypothesized myself some time ago that that kind of thing might be going on, but to read and hear so many other people thinking on those similar lines, it was like, yeah, this really makes sense. And I need to dig into that one as well. But yeah, the two books belong together because it's almost, if you like, the Mothman Prophecies is the story, the Eighth Tale material is the background to the story. It's like why we've got to this point of a belief idea that these things are essentially from here, but an alternative kind of version of here, like rather than being from some faraway planet.
Yeah, and I learned way too much about radio frequencies from that book, more than I ever wanted.
The super spectrum.
Yeah, for sure. So we do have to take a quick commercial break. And while we are at break, I want you guys to think about who your favorite character from the entire book was. And I will give you mine when we come back from the commercial. Deal?
Sounds good.
Deal.
All right, here's your commercial time. Are you haunted by legal troubles that just won't vanish? Do you suspect foul play beyond the natural realm? Hi, I'm Susan Graves, your paranormal attorney. If you're dealing with ghostly contracts, spooky disputes, or supernatural misdemeanors, I'm here to help. Don't let your legal issues haunt you. Call me, the lawyer who isn't afraid of what goes bump in the night. Remember, when the law gets paranormal, you need a lawyer with spirit. Call me today for a free consultation. Susan Graves, fighting for your rights, even from the other side. And we're back. So, my favorite character from the entire book is the man who stole the pen. It is the most pointless thing, and that is fascinating to me. And I think so I always try to put myself into their shoes. You know, if I was an ultra terrestrial, what would I do? And I would do random stuff to confuse or annoy people. So that was why that character, I loved him so much.
And it's also a good thing to have some of those clicking pens so that if you are visited by men in black, just throw some pens at them and they'll be distracted and they won't be asking you any more questions. You're trying to compensate your photographs.
But were there any characters that really stood out to any of you guys?
Oh, yeah, I've got one, but you guys go ahead.
After you, Bill.
You know, I've been thinking about this for a while and I'm drawing a blank. So if you guys could jump in, maybe that'll help my mind work better.
Leonard Sly, the guy from Duncan Falls. He was an elderly gentleman that couldn't sleep sometimes. So he'd go out and this is in Ohio. And he would wander around and he saw this strange looking L-shaped building next to a school that he'd never seen before. And so as he approaches it, he hears a voice coming from it, and to welcome him in, I think, and it freaked him out. So he started he went back home and he got his gun, and he came back and it was gone, and he called the police, and of course they just thought he's an old guy, doesn't know what he's talking about. When John Keel talked to him, he said that Leonard told him the story with no embellishments or whatever, but he said. I didn't exactly run, but I walked pretty fast going away from the building. And that's my favorite character in the Mothman Prophecies.
Well, for me, I'd actually deviate over to the movie and the scene where John Keel meets the former professor who's experienced strange things, and he starts to tell him what's happened to him. And there's one line that really, it gave me chills, and it's always stuck with me, and I often quite quick to other people about other this kind of stuff, is the line that you notice them, and they notice that you notice them. It's like, ooh, gives you shivers, and I think about that. But I know that's not of the real events, but that scene, I think, crystallized for me the slightly more sinister side of this. The film itself had been a series of strange events, obviously. It was like weird sightings, but then it took a different angle in that scene. It's like, but they noticed you noticed them. and now they know you're noticing them, and they don't like that. That was that kind of vibe it gave me. And I thought that was really good. That was a nice little scene. And so for me, that bit particularly of the movie rather than the books, saying it's been honest, since I read it, so I didn't get the chance to. But to me, that crystallized that notion of there's something more going on here that may be even deeper.
Those scenes with Richard Gere and Alan Bates were phenomenal. Of course,
Alan Bates, I remember his name, yeah.
Played Dr. Leek, Keel spelled backwards.
Yes.
And my favorite exchange is when, Richard Gere was really good in this film. Of course, Bates was too, but he's at a point where Bates is telling him all these things that happened to him. And Richard Gere, you can tell it's just toward the end of the movie, he's at his wit's end, and he said, "Didn't you need to know?" And Alan Bates has this kind of quizzical look on his face, and he cocks his head a little bit, and he says, "We're not allowed to know." And that's chilling also.
I have something like that written down as my favorite quote from the book. Something wants us to not understand this phenomenon in its true purpose.
Right.
Yeah, I love the exchanges between those two in the movie. And my favorite part that he talks about is when they're in Chicago the first time and they're looking up, and Bates points up to the window washer and he says, "That window washer up there, from where he's standing, he can see a little further down the road." But I think my favorite character in the movie is Gordon Smallwood, bar none. I just loved the way that Will Patton just owned that role. He did a fantastic job. And my favorite line from the movie is when he says, "And then I hear this weird howl coming out of the sink." And he's just losing his mind. I love that. But I've had to really think hard about this, guys, in terms of my favorite character from the book. And I think it's got to be Jay Peril. And for me, it's Jay Peril because she's on the Long Island end of things, which really gets lost when we talk about Mothman. People don't really go in depth about that, but she was responsible for a lot of the channeled prophecies that Keel was receiving, whether they were legitimate or not. And she's been kind of an enigma because she kind of fell off the radar after the Mothman Prophecies book, and nobody seems to know what happened to her or anything about her. And I find that to be really fascinating.
There's a mission trying to find her.
And you get more about Jay Peril. I forget what her real name was, but from the big breakthrough in the big blackout, and you get more from in Keel's thinking. This is in the midst of when he's buying into some of these messages and so forth. But you can see he keeps thinking about Jay Peril, for example. He said, is she hoaxing this? Is she making this up? And then you think, but there's certain things that she knows she couldn't possibly know. So you get more into the thinking process of Keel in those books than you do in the Mothman Prophecies.
And she could very well have been duped, just like he was.
Oh,
I think
sure.
Just like a lot of us researchers can, when we get closer to this phenomena, it really starts toying with us. That trickster thing, or that reflexivity, or whatever it might be, that goes on along the lines of the super spectrum that we just don't understand, really begins toying with us. And there's another one that Steve mentioned, the big breakthrough and the big blackout. There's one that came out a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, called The Big Bamboozle. And in that one, there are 2 or 3 articles written by Jay Peril, and they're fascinating.
Is that the one about Mount Misery?
Yes.
Okay. Mount Misery, New York, Long Island, I think, where a lot of weird stuff was going on, like you said, Bill, on Long Island. Wherever Keel was, it's almost like he was a lightning rod for some of this stuff.
They also tried to call that a Native American curse too.
Yeah, there you go.
I think that comes back to the whole idea of he's noticed them, he's talking about them, so they've noticed him talking about them, and they're going to keep a closer eye. So, yeah, the idea of becoming almost like a magnet for these kind of events. I mean, I've often talked about the idea that sort of in that other realm or world, if you are more attuned to it, you're like a beacon of light that's visible to them. They think, oh, what's this person doing? And they come towards you. But the more you're involved, the more you draw them to you.
And I mentioned the film. My first reaction to it was a bit negative because I'd read the book so many times and I wanted more of the book in there. I wanted more of the Men in Black, and of course, soon after I thought, well, they can't do the classic Men in Black because they've already done 2 silly films as comedies with the Men in Black,
Yeah.
and people are just going to associate it with that.
Mm.
But as time has gone on, I love the film as much as Bill does. And, Andy Mercer is a composer. And so I want to mention the soundtrack to the Mothman Prophecies, Tom and Andy, is phenomenal. Andy does a lot of, would you call it dark ambient? Is that correct?
Yes, that's
And that's kind of what the Mothman Prophecies, I would call that dark ambient. And it just fits the film so well.
Yes, I keep
Excellent.
saying that it was very good music. I remember that. Yeah, it was quite subtle. It did have a nice sort of flow of unworldliness to it sometimes as well. It was very
Right.
good music.
Yeah. So one of the things that kept like screaming from the back of my mind as I'm reading this, or other things like it, is the communication with the trickster entities. And Andy, I kind of wonder, how do you know what you're talking to? Because I'm not a sensitive person at all. I don't communicate with anything other than living humans.
Well, I've certainly over the years come to a very firm belief that what you talk to, how it presents itself, is in accordance with what your expectations are, what you're experiencing, what you believe them to be. I don't think these things have an identity of their own. They just assume what works for you, whether it's something that is for your personal history or your personal belief system, or something greater from your own cultural background, if you like. But I've become more and more convinced that these things exist, but they don't have an identity. You're not talking to, the old thing. I'm afraid it happens a lot in American paranormal TV shows, that this ghost is a demon. Really, it's hiding, it's pretending to be something else. I don't think it'll be a demon if you want it to be, because that's how you're framing it. But the things themselves have no particular identity. It's just they will communicate in a way that works for you. Whether they're giving you direct information of anything particular, don't know. But certainly that's how I always think of it. And so when you have something like Mothman, particularly, the identity kind of forms around the phenomena, the kind of from descriptions that we've got. This idea of the Mothman or a creature of that kind of form. I think it almost began, took that form because it was being talked about in that sense as a descriptive form, if you like, of what people were seeing and experiencing. And I think maybe it even refined itself even further based on those reports. Not that it was sitting reading the newspaper like that, but how people were reacting to and relating to this strange phenomena.
And that's pretty much the way John Keel described this Mr. Apple, APOL again, that he never met, but only talked to through channelers or whatever over the phone. It's like he had no identity and he just kind of faded away. And he said he talked to this whatever for hours sometimes. By the way, I've got to show off my my shirt here. John Keel rules. Yes. Okay. Okay. We're done with that. When I was reading Bill's book, what it brought home to me that I did meet a survivor of the bridge collapse, and his name was Bill Edmondson. And I met him in 2017 at the 50-year remembrance ceremony. He was driving a semi across the bridge when it went down. And unlike the film, when Richard Gere had all kinds of time to warn people off the bridge, this happened in about 30 to 40 seconds. And he went in the water. He was forced through the passenger window, right arm first. It's 20 degrees out. It's freezing. He gets out of the truck, comes to the surface, and he grabs onto some of the material he'd been hauling. And a tugboat captain saw him and pulled him up out of the water. And they got him to the hospital right away. There's an article on him in the Mothman Museum. So that's another thing that just brought all that even closer to home, hearing a personal one-on-one experience about that tragic night.
Yeah. So
We interviewed 11 people for Bridging the Tragedy. At least 6 of them talked about seeing that semi floating down the river and seeing the presence floating in the river and how profound and powerful those images were.
Yes, I remember that from the movie, obviously, the representation of what happened.
Right.
Briefly speaking of the movie, I was in excuse me, New York 2 years ago, and we happened to get tickets for Laura Linney doing a solo show, which we watched and enjoyed. And we literally sitting right by the front. And she did come off the stage at the end, was talking to some of the audience who hoped to get in and ask about Mothman, but unfortunately we didn't get a chance. But that was quite an interesting experience. She was a very good actress. Seeing that one stage show was brilliant. But yeah, it's a shame to get a chance to speak to her.
So, did any of you see the Hellier series? Or
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
I've seen both seasons of it. I thought it was very well done. I really enjoyed it. Towards the end of it, I think it got scripted, and maybe was scripted throughout, maybe part of it anyhow. But the very beginning of it, and maybe the first half a dozen episodes, I found really very riveting, and there were some really interesting correlations and things that they talked about, and that dovetail really very well with Keel's books.
It was very well done. I can't help but think that possibly the whole thing may have started out with a hoax that they followed up on. I mean, and it was right. They did the right thing by investigating and looking into it. I'm just not sure. I just don't know how much substance there was behind the original events that pulled them in. And when they get into the Indrid Cold stuff, I think, I'm sorry, but Indrid Cold does not exist. Maybe he did briefly at one time. Maybe there was some kind of hoax going on, but I don't know what. Somebody is pulling some strings, and I don't think they are. I don't think the Hellier people have hoaxed anything. I think they have gone ahead and tried to unravel mysteries. And but it was very well done. And I talked to Seth Breedlove, who does Small Town Monsters, and he was very impressed with their editing and their production and so forth.
I agree. It was very well made, edited and put together. But I have similar thoughts to Steve. I think they were hoaxed. I think they kind of figured out going along during the series they'd been hoaxed, but decided to keep going with the progress. They got so far with it already. But I think that moment when they realised that the original communication had come from nowhere near where it's supposed to come from, and came from somewhere near to where I think it was Greg was living at the time, I thought, that's ringing two big alarm bells to me. This sounds like they're being duped here. But because they're so invested in the program, they carried on going on with it. I could be wrong, but it just felt to me that it got to a point where it started to feel it was drifting a little bit. Certainly the second series kind of drifted a little bit too much. And I think they were trying to sort of fill time and bringing things that Indrid Cole into it was kind of stretching a little bit for me. And whilst I quite enjoyed it, Greg doesn't like me. We've had an altercation once on Facebook, and I've been blocked by him completely. So nothing to do with his program, but something completely unrelated. But yeah, so my views are a little tainted by that experience, I have to say. So
if you haven't seen The Unbinding yet, it's definitely worth watching. I thought it was very well done. It's very interesting, and it's not as sensationalized as Hellier was.
right, I'll check that out.
It's definitely worth watching.
This is all completely foreign to me. I feel like I have a list of stuff I have to watch now.
I was going to mention earlier that Susie and I are not experiencers. I forget what Susie has a term for that. What is it?
Paranormal repellent.
Yeah, that's it. Paranormal repellent without an aerosol. It's just natural.
I find it just amazing with you, Steve, particularly. I mean, you've been in this for a few years now, so I'm really surprised you had no experiences.
I had that one weird experience with a television set, which I will not repeat, and that's.
But I had one weird experience with a television set too, which I think is weird. That both of us, our one weird experience was with a TV.
Maybe we should just give somebody else the remote and not touch it.
You know, now that you're mentioning TVs, and my wife just walked into the room, she's not going to come on camera though, but she was in the process of, we're working on our next book right now, and she was transcribing one of the interviews, and she had it on the YouTube up on the TV set that we have mounted on our wall. And as it was getting to a particularly interesting part of the interview, the TV just died. I mean, it totally died. And I guess it was probably 8 or 9 years old. I didn't realize we'd had it for that long, but it just it just went right during that transcription session.
Well, I told my TV experience where I walked into the room and it turned on, was flipping through channels to a guy that interviewed me at the Mothman Museum yesterday. And he said he knew a guy, they had kind of a similar experience in a motel across the river, and it turned out it was the same motel that we were both in, not the same room. But I thought, whoa, okay, maybe I'm not crazy, but I still could be crazy. I just want to make that clear.
Well, you might be still. It's all right. So, what was your TV experience then?
It was, I had gone out to the TNT area north of Point Pleasant alone at night to impress the babes. I wanted to be able to tell the ladies that, hey, I'm a very, very brave guy. So I came back. I was on Route 62, experienced a couple flashes of light, like a couple of strobes, and I thought, that's weird. Didn't have the presence of mind to think where it was on the road. And so I went back across the river, went to my motel, and opened up the door, and the TV set turned on by itself and started flipping steadily through stations, just like a blur. And I thought, no, this doesn't happen to me. It happens to other people. And so I unplugged the thing and went to bed. And then the next year, there was another similar experience, not quite the same, in the room next to it with a couple of friends. And then a few years later, two couples were having some weird thing going on with their TV, and something flew off the table during a Mothman festival. So all in this one corner of the motel. And the way I always end this is that if I brought something back with me from the TNT, fortunately, he's still there flipping channels because he never came home with me.
That's good. And Susie, what was your TV experience?
Mine was when I was having those nightmares that turned out to be about my great grandmother. Someone had suggested like talking to her and setting boundaries and like telling her to leave me alone. So I did that. And then I get up to walk out of the room, and I walk past my dresser, which had my TV on it at the time. And as I'm walking by, right after I walk by, the TV flew off the dresser.
Oh, blimey.
And I had a runner underneath it, and that was still there. It was just the TV. So much like Steve just turned that TV off, I took that TV and put it in the closet.
Shades of the last scene in the movie Poltergeist, right?
Yes, there's both more poltergeist based than anything else. Those experiences, definitely very strange. Well, I've had too many to list. I've been doing ghost hunting for 20 odd years, so I've had lots of weird experiences. What about you, Bill? You got anything in particular?
Yeah, something that we talked about earlier when Steve mentioned Route 77. We were talking about Injured Cold and some of the things that had happened on that route. So we've covered a lot of ground tonight, but one of the things that I was thinking with this whole trickster element that kind of gets involved with those of us that investigate this strange stuff. So there's been the alleged Chicagoland Mothman flap that's been going on off and on for 10, 15 years. And Jackie and I first got involved with investigating it with the Illinois State MUFON director, Sam Moranto, but we quickly found some things that they didn't jive with us. So we didn't feel that it was a horribly legitimate type thing that was going on in Chicagoland area, which would bummed us out because we live 60 miles from downtown Chicago. So it was right here. So what we did do is we went to Thatcher Woods, which is right in suburban Chicago. We did a ghost box session there, and we got some data that really correlated with some of the stuff in Point Pleasant. So on our next trip that we took to Point Pleasant, Jackie and a lady that was with her at the time, they did a ghost box session, and it mentioned 77. And we had a lot of inverse numbers like 13s and 31s. 31s were very prominent in Chicagoland and in the Mothman reports there. 13s were very prominent in Point Pleasant. But they used the ghost box, and it said a place to go visit was one of the signals it got. So they went to Route 77, and then they did a ghost box session there, and that took them back to Endy Way, the point right there in Point Pleasant where the two rivers come together, where Cornstalk is buried. And we got all kinds of really interesting information from all the different sites that we did these sessions at that led us to believe that either we were being guided along or we were being messed with, or a combination of both. So that whole trickster thing that goes on, I think, with all these investigations, I just really think that a lot of this stuff is over our heads. We kind of co-create it to a certain degree, but then it's mirrored back by whatever is out there that's giving us the signal back in return.
Yes, that kind of almost like a two-way flow, the idea of these things forming around what we expect. What about, question for everybody, other examples of Mothman actually definitely occurring in other parts of America or the world even? Are there any real possible examples? I know that we talked about the Chicago one there, but there are other definite examples of what could be the same phenomena elsewhere?
Well, there was a similar one in the Bridgewater Triangle. I believe it was 71, and it was a police officer that spotted him. He was on his way home, and he got to an intersection. Is this Keel making an
No,
appearance?
this is Willis.
Willis. Oh,
Keel
would
is
have been.
sound asleep.
Sorry, I got distracted by Cat. Police officer was on his way home, and he was coming to an intersection, and he saw a figure about 6 feet tall. He thought it was a hitchhiker, and he pulled his car up a little bit closer. And as he did that, wings just erupted from its back, and it flew straight up into the air. No flapping of the wings at all. Just, the wings came out and it went straight up. And he was like so taken by it. He went back to the police station and reported it, which did not go well for him.
Well, the things don't, do they?
Yeah, but it was not like, so in the area, there's Thunderbird sightings, there's pterodactyl sightings, but that was a winged humanoid sighting. He thought it was a man at first. But he didn't report it having red eyes. There's been no chasing cars or anything like that, but the physical description similar there. And I don't know a lot about it, but I know around Chernobyl, there have also been some sightings reported.
That's the one I was going to mention. I'd heard that as well, that this sort of, again, it's one of those things. Is the phenomenon starting to form and appear in a way that correlates with people's beliefs and ideas, or is it that this is the same phenomenon itself appearing in different parts of it? But yes, Chernobyl's one I'd heard of before that has seen a variety of strange phenomena, and then whether it's to do with mutated living animals, obviously mutation through the radiation, or it is more of a paranormal entity, I don't know, but I've certainly heard of that one before.
Well, there are many, and of course, John
Someone in
Keel
the
has
comments just mentioned the element of Cornwall.
Yes, that's one.
Yes,
very similar, but not identical. Keel talks about, and there's the, I think it might be the second chapter in the book, the flutter of black wings or whatever, where he goes through a whole array of winged whatever. Wing weirdos, they call them sometimes, and they're not Mothman per se, but there was the Houston Batman, the Wisconsin Man Bat, and all kinds of bizarre things. There's only one report I know that was very similar to, I'm going to say, my Mothman here in Point Pleasant, and that gives almost 3 years earlier to the day that the Scarberries and Mallets were chased by this winged creature in Kent, England. I think they call it the Saltwood Horror. A group of students were coming back from a dance. They saw a light come down behind a grove of trees, and it disappeared. Then the light reappeared and disappeared. And then they saw this 6-7 foot tall, sort of a humanoid creature. Didn't seem to have a head. It kind of shuffled along like the Mothman, bat-like wings, and it did not have the red eyes. But that's the closest I've ever heard of a something like the Mothman. It's very interesting because Paul Devereaux calls it one of the proto entities, where the light or the craft or whatever it is seems to be inseparable or morph into the entity.
Yes.
And so, but that's the, like they say, the term Mothman is thrown around quite a bit. If Keel was onto something in the Mothman Prophecies, if these were truly transmogrifications, if they're paraphysical, he became less and less enamored with whether or not the craft had portholes or what it would look like or what the creature looked like. He wanted to understand the cosmic mechanism behind these things. And he also discovered that people that witnessed creatures or UFOs would suffer from the same physical ailments, thirst, muscle ache. And even Connie Carpenter, one of the original Mothman witnesses, did not see a UFO or a light, but she received conjunctivitis, that eye burn, when she saw the Mothman in broad daylight. So I just, like I say, hey, Mothman, he's here in Point Pleasant. I know because I know where his statue is. So don't mess with my Mothman. What do you?
A couple of thoughts, actually. I mean, first of all, I've just come back from Cornwall, funny enough, on holiday for a couple of days.
Oh, very good.
Didn't see the almond, I'm afraid, not at all. But there is, I think that's one thing you say about the eyes, is a phenomenon seems almost radiation-like, seems to be linked to these phenomena as well. So which brings you back to about Chernobyl, of course, being a highly radiated area. So maybe guess top of my head, they're drawn to the radiation, maybe. So you get these forms and creatures appearing, animals, energy animals, whatever you want to call them, are focusing around areas of radiation, because you can talk about the idea of these things appearing near nuclear sites as well, nuclear bases. So maybe there is a correlation there with the whole power, energy, nuclear connection that may be connected with them. Again, obviously with the TNT area, I mean, it's not nuclear, but of course there's a lot of material waste there as well. So maybe there's some kind of almost like Earth connection, if you like. The idea of these things are perhaps trying to guard the land or look after or warn of danger, which of course leads us to the bridge collapse.
There are rumors that there was some nuclear activity or going on in the TNT area. I have no idea if there's any substance to them or whatever.
Speaking of the TNT area, it's the last time we were out there, Steve, for the Mothman Festival. You know, we had Michael Hacker with us, who's the narrator of a lot of John Keel and Brad Steiger compilation books,
Right.
as well as Jacques Vallée. And we took him out to the TNT, and Jackie and Michael and I were just driving through. When we came back from that, Jackie's left ear was bleeding.
Oh my God.
I had a minor case of conjunctivitis, which just blew our minds. And by the way, Jackie says to say hello, Steve. She heard your voice. She said, "Is that Steve Ward?" I said, "Yeah, that's Steve."
Hi, Jackie. The Night of the Bleeding Ear is one of the chapters in the Mothman Prophecies, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So one of the most things that I found the least believable in this book was when Keel talks about male UFO witnesses
I know where she's going.
STD symptoms after.
The cosmic clap.
Yes.
Good story. You got it from UFO. Okay, fine.
That's what married guys need to have, that excuse in back of their head, I guess. I mean, if they're
It
messing around.
might have flown in the 60s.
I mean,
Now, people are going to want to read the Mothman Prophecies now to find out about the cosmic clap. I'll tell you that.
How you can avoid it.
yes, ways to avoid possibly people. I was just thinking again about the Owlmen of Cornwall. Of course, the Owlmen or the Mothman are going to look pretty similar, aren't they? So
Right.
it can be that kind of similar phenomena again. I've just a little book I've been working on for a number of years and never anywhere near finishing yet. Is a collection of strange, sort of high strangeness occurrences in mainly sort of Victorian times, 1800s up to the 1930s. I wrote a book on basically spells and chants from that sort of period, Victorian times to the 1930s, and a kind of follow-up one was this collection of weird tales of strange experiences. And there was one particular one that sticks in my mind when we talk about Mothman, is one example up in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland where fishermen had gone out. This is the 1890s. A group of fishermen had gone out in their trawler, basically to fish. This bird-like creature that was about 5 to 6 feet tall with glowing red eyes landed on the topmost mast of the ship, stayed there for about 3 days, unmoving, just looking at them from above, and then disappeared. And the description they gave us, they said it was like a tall bird-like creature with glowing red eyes, and straight you start thinking of Mothman, and this is the 1890s in northern Scotland. So this kind of creature seems to crop up in other parts of the world. Well, it's specifically a Mothman, not seeing the Point Pleasant one, of course, but a Mothman-esque creature seems to occur various places around the world.
And when you mentioned nuclear sites earlier, a few months ago, somebody asked me to look into if there were Pukwudgie sightings in this particular area in Illinois. And they had said they had seen one near a pond next to a nuclear power plant. And something I always look into when I'm looking into little people sightings is if there are Thunderbird sightings in the same area. And I found tons of them in that same area. I don't remember the name of the town, but there was a nuclear power plant there. I think it was Southern Illinois off the top of my head. But yeah, and the Bridgewater Triangle too. No power plant, but a lot of the sightings are under these high tension power lines that run straight through it. It's like a creature highway type of thing there.
Susan Sayer told us when we interviewed her that in the TNT area, even today, sometimes vehicles will be driving along and the power just cuts out. The cars still totally stall and everything shuts down, and then it fires right back up again. And there are some high tension wires that are back there also.
Right.
It sort of speaks to the whole idea of EM distortion fields. These things, things like nuclear power or power cables, distort the local EM field. And if one of the theories that paranormal phenomena, particularly like ghostly phenomena, occur because of distortions and recordings within the EM field, as opposed to the idea of the stone tape theory of buildings. It's the EM field of the immediate area is recording these events. So it could be that they are triggers, if you like, as well. The energy that's there is triggering off these kind of weird sightings, almost as if it is the way these things get into our reality through the distortions of the EM field, because things distort it, be it nuclear, be it mainline power, that kind of thing.
What about Keel's writing style? Colin Wilson wrote a great book called Alien Dawn. He talks a lot about his correspondence with John Keel. And in there he says John Keel is incapable of writing a dull sentence. Are there any passages or scenes in the Mothman Prophecies that stand out to any of you?
So a few weeks ago, I listened to Keel on Art Bell, their interviews. And that he was much more likable from that than in writing. In writing, I feel like he comes across like egotistical and judgmental. He opens the book talking about the woman coming to the door in a cheap bathrobe. I'm like, leave her bathrobe alone.
Mail order bathrobe.
Yep. But he was much more likable in that interview, spoken word, to me.
I must admit that actually threw me when I first read the book for the first time. I realized he was talking about himself coming to the door. It was like, oh, right. It was almost like, funny, kind of like a Lovecraftian style of like changing of the character, realizing the character's the one that's going mad, or Robert Chambers kind of style, that it's the character talking about themselves almost in the third person. I think, oh, right, now he's talking about himself coming to their door. It quite threw me at first.
Well, for a long time, I thought that was simply a literary device. When he talks about those two people ended up dying on the bridge. So in an interview, he was asked about that, and he said, no, he actually came across that story later one time when he was in Point Pleasant. People were telling the story about this couple that died on the bridge that had this mysterious stranger all dressed in black that came to the door. So I thought, how cool is that? Mm-hmm. I have a couple. One of my passages, I can't quote it directly, but I always dust it off prior to every Mothman festival, because it sounds exactly like John Keel was foretelling the Mothman festival. And it was talking about something about the strange ones were coming to West Virginia. They were trooping down the hollers like leprechauns seeking impoverished shoemakers. What was it? I forget what it was, but and the procession of the damned marched once more. Anyway, it sounded like everybody, coming into Point Pleasant, all the thousands of people. I should have got the quote out to actually read it. And of course, the other one, the best one is, the year of the Garuda was at hand. A shadow was passing over a little town I'd never heard of, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and it goes on. There's so much good stuff in there, and even the opening lines. About the thunder and the fingers of lightning tore angry holes in the sky. But man,
Keel comes across as a little bit, a little racist, really, in certain spots. He comes across pretty sexist in certain spots in the Mothman Prophecies. But if you take a look at what he writes about Jay Perro in The Big Blackout, holy cow, does he slam her. He just totally slams her. She's not hot enough for him. He doesn't use those words, but that's really what he's coming down to.
Well, of course,
these other entities are trying to pair them together, and he's like, "What's up with this? She's not good looking. She's not good looking at all."
There was like a person.
I feel like him and I would have fight.
It's a good thing he didn't meet that redhead. I'll tell you. Oh, geez, he would devote a whole chapter to her. Night of the Angry Redhead.
But just because we would fight does not mean I'm going to write him off, because if I wrote everyone off that I would fight with, there would be no one left.
He had a great sense of humor, but you're right. It doesn't come across in his writing all the time, and it does in the interviews. He was a fun guy.
Oh, God. Yeah, the lectures, there are several lectures you can find sometimes on YouTube. Bad video, but he talks about his military experience, and when he went in Jadoo, when he went to Egypt and Tibet and so forth. I mean, he was such an interesting guy. And the interview that Susie referred to, that was the interview he gave Art Bell, was in 2002 when the film came out. He hadn't done any interviews for a long time. And Art Bell knew very little about the Mothman. This is back when John Keel was being forgotten about. Thank God now that he's been revived and his books are in print and so forth. But he was Bill and I have talked about this many times about how far ahead of the time Keel was with, I mean, and people detested him back from the 60s on because he dared question the sacrilege of extraterrestrials. I think Giorgio Tsoukalos, but maybe that's why his hair is like that, because he read John Keel.
I love the fact that he wasn't afraid to be the lone dissenting voice in the room.
Right.
I've never really been that guy. I kind of like to go along with things and get along with people, but he didn't seem to have a problem coming out and basically telling you where he was coming from, even if there was only 1% and he was the 1% and 99 were against him.
Right.
That ratio has certainly changed these days. I think it's moving more towards the ultra-terrestrial for theory, although obviously the nuts and bolts aliens people will stick to theirs like grim death. But I think the field is moving in that more general direction and more of a unified direction, as well as different kinds of phenomena being seen as aspects of the same thing rather than being completely separate. The idea, when I was first involved in the idea of studying ghosts and UFOs, like, no, you one or the other. They're different worlds. Mix those up. And then I'd say that's not true. Very early on, back in the sort of late mid-90s, when I was first involved, a group called EarthQuest, we investigated everything, no matter what it was, whatever kind of phenomenon. But then when the advent of ghost TV programs like Most Haunted that started the whole thing off, and American shows, then this big separation began to occur between ghost paranormal stuff and UFO type paranormal. So it did diverge considerably. Then there's coming back to the middle ground again, I feel. But people like Keel are the ones that have pushed forward these ideas of ultra-terrestrials rather than extraterrestrials, and to me it makes perfect sense.
Even Jacques Vallée, his first two books were looking at the phenomenon as more of a nuts and bolts proposition with an anatomy of a phenomenon and challenge to science. And then you can almost see these people like Vallée throwing their hands up. And then he wrote Passport to Magonia, looking at the connections between elements of folklore and some modern day UFO experiences.
I often wonder what made Vallée's direction change so quite dramatically. So almost like midway through, or further on in his writing career, there was a real change. Another day, I imagine. But yes, something we should get on to. That would be definitely a future book, The Passport to Magonia, for our group.
Right.
That was on the list for this time. It got beat by this Mothman Prophecies in Steve's non-existent book.
Yeah, that should be the next show. Steve's non-existent book.
Boy, I'm gonna have to pull a Gray Barker and just start making it up. Then I think
you can do it.
I could. I'll source. Bill Kuselis is my source. And
there you go. Yeah,
this is borrowed.
Ghost written by Susie Bastille, edited by Andy Mercer.
Yeah, published too.
We're all accessories before the fact now.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen. I think it's time to wrap it up. Otherwise, we'd talk about Keel all night long with this group, I fear.
And Susie, I would hate to keep talking about John Keel. You know that.
I know you. This has been so painful for you, I'm sure. Just want to thank Bill again for joining us. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Well, I think we should thank Susie for creating this podcast and this book club, because this has been a blast.
And this has all started from my desire to force people to talk about books that I'm reading with me. So,
I see.
I'm on board very early on with this.
Andy, we've been manipulated. That's what happened.
Oh, I don't mind that. I can live with that.
Okay.
There's a reason I like trickster entities.
But this has been a great time. So, and one thing I would have to say is I've been doing shows with Steve for about 5 years now, and I don't think there's ever been a single show where John Keel's not been mentioned at least once. So had a chance to mention you many times tonight.
It's in my contract, and I would not,
Absolutely. I
neglect
wrote
my
the contract, so I know that.
All right. Thank you all. And thank everyone in the comments and everyone watching. It was a lot of fun. And I'm looking forward to the next book, whichever one that will be. So get on over to the Facebook group and we'll start a new poll for next time's book.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Yes,
Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night. Good morning from the UK.